Today looks like we still have national parks. Let's take a look at the Albert Gallatin Boone's Trading Post in Kansas City, Missouri. In the first half of the 19th century, the other side of North America was extremely far away. It was the essence of the idea of away that formed so much of the American idea of how the world ran and how to solve problems. But by the 1820s, away was also becoming inviting and exciting. For people with dreams of wide open spaces and a plot of land of my own, whether they had been evicted from their ancestral lands by the British or American military, or they were born in the colonies and then America, or they had come over in search of their fortune or adventure, or they had been enslaved and ended that status either through purchase, manumission, or self-emancipation, for all these people, go west was an idea and an instruction many people were taking up with enthusiasm. For those of us who have ventured away from home for a weekend, a week, or a month, the idea of what it takes when you are self-responsible for shelter, for food, and safety, the list and the just sheer amount of baggage can become daunting. But how did one provide for oneself in the age before Amazon or even the Sears Roebuck Company? The answer? Trading posts. While they may have had a limited selection, they did specialize in the essential, and one of the places most focused on the essential were the towns along the fording spots of the Missouri River. Getting across the Mississippi was pretty regularized by now, if you knew where to go, but the Missouri was the current wall at the edge. And more importantly, once you crossed it, you were truly on your own. Every barrel of pork, every nail, every pot, pan, horseshoe, bit of rope, bar of soap, cone of sugar, and so on. If you wanted it, you had to bring it. There was not a fragment of what was called civilization in the 19th century, until you ran across the Spanish missions and ranchos and haciendas, and even those were exceptionally short on the essentials of iron, sugar, and beef. So these trading posts at the top of the trail on the eastern shores of the Missouri River were incredibly important to those getting ready to take the leap into the unknown of away. Westport, now engulfed by the city of Kansas City, Missouri, was a center of these last stops. There is a marker supported by the National Park Service on a building that once housed A.G. Boone's store. Other aspects of this town are touched by its role as a gateway to the West and the unknown. It would also work as a pivot in the history of bloody Kansas as America fought with itself over who counted as people, and would play a great role in the great games of the railroad to come. So take a trip to the middle of the country, back when it truly was in the middle of it all, and take a gander at Albert Gallatin Boone's store and the rest of the town of Westport in Kansas City, Missouri, which was your last chance to grab some coffee before you ventured into the great unknown. Episode 153, Coffee Finds a New Home. This week, I take a look at the entrance of coffee into mainstream American society. It had been here, yes, but mainly as a fancy drink for fancy people in fancy rooms with fancy cups to drink it from. But starting at the beginning of the 19th century, coffee begins its life as a drink of the people. If you want to hear about how tea started to get the shove and just how weak American coffee was, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is how to brew a cup of coffee from green beans, the way any decent coffee was made at this time, and in fact way into the 20th century. Begin by acquiring green coffee beans from your importer or dry goods store. Ask your proprietor where the beans have come from and when the shipment arrived. Beans from the ports of Mocha and Java are preferred, but also tend to be quite dear. And since they are coming from Africa or somewhere really far away, they can get musty. So it is important to smell the beans before purchase. They should have the scent of greenery that has gone a bit dry in the sun. If your purveyor won't allow you to handle the beans before purchase, you know he has a poor selection. There are also coffees available from Saint-Domingue. The French do seem to produce decent coffee, and since it's from just over the way, it does tend to be a bit less dear and suffer less from mustiness. But the brew always seems to come out quite strong and bitter. There are beans from Brazil, but those Portuguese seem to have odd tastes in coffee, and these beans are usually even less appealing, though often the cheapest option. Once you have your beans, you should store them high in your pantry in a dark, dry place. Hanging the bag from the rafters will keep them safe from rats and other invaders. To roast the beans, begin them over a low flame or raised up high over a hot coal. Heat up your beans in a wide pan while constantly stirring them. Or, if you do this regularly and have a fireplace with a hook, get a tin coffee roaster that you can hang over the flame and turn with the crank. Just make sure you open the door in the side and check the coffee regularly. You first want to get the beans warmed through so they dry out. If you don't, it's like a bad cake or bad bread, scorched on the outside and raw in the middle. You will know they are warmed through and getting dry when they start to shift from green to pale yellow. This, by the way, is the longest and slowest part of the process. At this point, you can bring them closer to the fire. And whatever you do, keep stirring. Over the next few minutes, your beans will start to go from dry grass yellow to various shades of brown, and they will also start to shed fluff, some chaff. This is the last little bit of the seed from when the coffee cherry was sloughed off. Did you know they come inside red beans? Your beans will start to pop like popcorn and begin to smell a bit coffee-ish. If you're going for an appropriate delicate roast and want to avoid any burned bits, take them off now. A dark blonde is an excellent color for ladies' coffee. Though if you are roasting for gentlemen, especially for after their brandy and cigars, keep the beans going until the coffee makes a second popping sound and starts to exude coffee oils. Once your coffee has obtained the desired color, get your coffee out of the pan or roaster and spread it out in a wide bowl or dish. Nothing ruins all your hard work like burnt beans, which is what will happen if you leave them in a hot pan. While some people insist upon roasting coffee daily, I see no reason for this. However, you must only grind your beans moments before they are used for the best flavor. But roasting coffee, like baking day and washing day, can be confined to a weekly task. Your coffee can be ground to a gunpowder consistency in a mortar and pestle. Or from the same merchant where you purchase your beans, you can get one of two types of coffee grinders. There's the kind from foreign parts that was good enough for our founding fathers, a brass cylinder with two grinding plates that crushes coffee into a fairly fine powder. Handily, the handle folds up and can be stored inside the grinder. This makes it particularly nice for picnics or when you must travel. There's also a new kind with a crank on top that grinds the beans into a little drawer. The coffee isn't ground to such a dust. It's a little less work and not so expensive. Once you have ground beans, now you can make your coffee. And first of all, you must scald out your coffee pot. That is, heat it up with the water to scalding, just below boiling. This makes the pot hot and ensures that it is clean. For each pint of water you plan to use, you will require about 2 heaping teaspoonfuls of coffee, though you may adjust this as you get to know your preferred coffee and your guests' tastes. To ensure the clearest coffee, set your water to boil in a separate kettle. Place the ground coffee in your coffee pot. Beat up the white of an egg and stir that into your coffee grounds. Moisten this mixture with a tablespoon of cold water, or enough so the coffee grounds are thoroughly wetted. If you happen to be in a season where eggs are not available, a piece of dried fish skin may suffice. Once this is complete, add the correct amount of boiling water. Place your coffee pot over the heat and boil for 12 more minutes. Make sure when the grounds come up to the surface with the first boiling, they are stirred back in. Some prefer their coffee boiled slightly less, but a long boil will ensure that the harshest coffee flavors are cooked out. Once you have boiled for the necessary amount of time, pour a small cup to see if the brew is clear. If so, remove from the heat, pour over with a half teacup of cold water and let it stand for 5 minutes. Pour the brewed coffee out of the coffee pot and into a warmed serving coffee pot and bring it to the table immediately. Be sure to provide milk or cream and adequate sugar for your guests' enjoyment. If this is for stronger after-dinner coffee, you may consider using 2 tablespoons and a half per pint of water. And should you be entertaining foreigners who like their coffee stronger still, use 3 heaping tablespoons per pint. And that is all you need to know to make your proper early 19th century coffee. As you just heard, there's a lot there. I'm going to skip over the part of how coffee got to America because to find that out, you can jump back to episodes 33 and 82 to get the scoop on that. But beyond that, it is still rather remarkable that by the year 1800, tea was largely available in basically 2 places, either from the Chinese and a little bit was coming out of Japan. Coffee, on the other hand, had become an international crop. It was still grown in its home range around Ethiopia in the northeast of East Africa, and one of its main ports of export was out of the city of Al-Mocha in Yemen. It was to be found as a plantation and export crop in many more places. The Dutch were growing it in their Indonesian plantations by the end of the 17th century. The agricultural work was done entirely by enslaved locals while the Dutch filled up their pockets with the profits from exporting coffee out of the port of Java. The French had converted large swaths of Saint-Domingue, the past and future island of Haiti, now Hispaniola, into a coffee and sugar factory. Because the indigenous population of the island had been thoroughly slaughtered by Columbus and his band of mercenaries through a combination of introduced diseases, enslavement, and bloody-minded revenge expeditions by the end of the 16th century, when the French took over in the 17th, they made use of the traffic of West Africans across the Atlantic to populate a colonial regime of plantations. And I'll quickly repeat myself from a previous coffee episode because it bears repeating. The French military dignitary and diarist Bernardin Saint-Pierre observed during a 1773 trip to Saint-Domingue, "I do not know if coffee and sugar are essential to the happiness of Europe, but I know well that these 2 vegetables are a source of misery for the inhabitants of 2 great regions of the world. America has been depopulated so as to have land to plant them. Africa has been depopulated so as to have the people to cultivate them." And it wasn't just the French doing this. After all, the first to import Africans to work for them in the Americas were the Spanish and the Portuguese. The French were pretty much in 4th place after the British. The Dutch had a Caribbean presence as well, which I know almost nothing about. I keep catching hints of the Dutch presence, and I'm going to have to figure out a side quest to Suriname someday. But for the most part, the Dutch were more concentrated in Indonesia and other islands of the Indian Ocean. Spain, while mainly focused on mining silver, did set up a few coffee plantations, but it was the Portuguese looking for a bigger chunk of land than that edge of the Iberian Peninsula who really took advantage of the Treaty of Tordesillas and made Brazil into the land of sugar, pineapples, and coffee. Again, they found the locals too troublesome. After all, they had this habit of disappearing back into the jungle that surrounded all the plantations, so the Portuguese also trafficked in Africans to work there. The location of Brazil in the sea roads at the height of the age of sail did mean that they were able to take advantage of people purchased on both the east and west coasts of Africa. It's a long explanation as to why this is so, but it had much to do with the fact that most naval navigation in those days consisted of pointing the boat in a given direction and just keep going till you hit some land. But what this all wraps up to mean is that coffee was grown in its East African homeland in the colonies run by the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, the English. They were Team Tea with all their connections in China, and were about to become hardcore Team Tea as they got their Indian tea plantations up and running in the 1820s. And not by the Americans. What it really came down to when it came to coffee, it was like right there. Coffee was to be had right off the coast, being imported by like our best buds, the French. And it came in with the caravans of ships crossing the Atlantic, along with the brass and spices and enslaved Africans. It is in this age that we get the origin story of coffee's first nicknames. Mocha and Java were the first places that coffee was arriving from, and the French word café lent its name to some of the early coffee houses, Maison du Café, as America's urban spaces continued to expand. As for getting the beans green, well, that's the only way they were sold at this point. People may not have known much about coffee at this time, but pre-cooked anything was extremely rare. Why would coffee be any different? They weren't going to get any other sort of bean cooked either. The proverbial weakness of American coffee, as noted by British and French diarists alike, comes from the fact that it was quite pricey, even if it was available right across the water from the French and the British in Jamaica, and the fact that Americans were making the most of their easy access to sugar. They liked this smooth, weak brew to sweeten and sip and socialize over. To put things into perspective, let's look at American cowboy coffee, the modern equivalent of the early 19th century boiled coffee. It uses a ratio of about a liter of water to a quarter cup of ground coffee. For the metric compared, a liter is the same as 2 pints of water, which is also 4 cups, which is also a quart. See? Simple. The quarter cup of grounds to a liter of water is pretty close to that ratio of 2 heaping tablespoons per pint, that is, 2 cups, as called for in the original recipe. And if you take that over to modern baking, there's 4 tablespoons per quarter cup, and if you're doing this by weight, that comes out to about 16 grams or a whole entire half ounce of coffee per liter of water. Modern American regular old Mr. Coffee drip coffee machine coffee drinkers tend to go in for something a bit stronger, closer to the ratio for those strong coffee-loving foreigners spoken of in the early 19th century cookery books. Okay, actually, some modern drip coffee drinkers might even still make stronger coffee than those hopeless Americans attempting to do better for their guests. The modern amount lies between a half cup of coffee and 3/4 of a cup of coffee per liter of water. By weight, that's somewhere between just over a whole entire ounce and up to 2 ounces. For you metric types, that's around 30 to 55 grams. While the recommended strong strength foreign coffee would have been about 6 tablespoons to the liter, which is still 2 tablespoons short of that minimum of half a cup of coffee to a liter. French press coffee runs around 2 ounces or 60 grams per liter of water, and the fancy pour-over ratios run around 50 to 70 grams. That's on either side of 2 ounces per liter. Though honestly, from everything I've read, I'm pretty sure it's absolutely against the rules to make an entire liter of pour-over coffee all in one go. So in conclusion, 1800s coffee was often prepared at a ratio of 16 grams of coffee to the liter. Whereas now, people will top out at 70 grams to a liter of water. Wow. Now, for the really much more important question, what was up with the egg? Well, tea is made with leaves that are easily, more or less, strained out. The grounds of coffee, once you're done brewing them, are floaty, gritty bits. And if there's one thing a 17th and 18th and even 19th century cook and brewer was familiar with, it was floaty, gritty bits. In your beer, in your sugar, in your broth. It was common to use different things to strain liquids through, or to cook them with to get them to stick to something you could easily strain out. An egg white raft was regularly used to strain broths to clarify it. Alcoholic punches were regularly mixed with milk that would be curdled by the acidic ingredients. And then the curds would be strained out using linen cloth. That would take out all the gritty bits and a lot of the harsh flavors from the subpar liquors. In the days when sugar was still a bit rough when it came off the cone, it was often clarified in the kitchen, especially when needed for meringues or the finer sort of cakes. And again, a raft of egg whites was used. And in beer and winemaking, the swim bladder of various fishes, known generally as isinglass, would be used to put out, yes, the floaty gritty bits, and make for a clearer end product. This, incidentally, is why some beer and wine will be rejected by some vegetarians and vegans, and why you will sometimes see the vegan marking on beer and wine. And here you were thinking, and they made of plants? Well, now you have your answer. Some of them are clarified using fish parts. The active ingredient of all of these items, egg whites, milk, and fish swim bladders, is protein. And the complicated foldy shapes of proteins are quite good at picking up, floaty, gritty bits. This is why fish skin would do in a pinch. The collagens that are present in fish skin, they'll do the same job, at least better than nothing. So even though the home of an 1800s American lady was no longer where beer was being made, isinglass was still present. Now it was mostly used for making blancmanges and other jellies, but the kitchen of this age, even though it might lack a modern fine wire or fine cloth sieve, it still had plenty of things that were useful for straining out, floaty, gritty bits. At this point in time, protein hadn't really been recognized as a nutritional category, but the professional cook, she knew it when she saw it, and she knew what it was good for. That's right, pulling out those floaty, gritty bits. Now, where is the technology of the coffee grinding apparatus? Pretty much the whole world agreed up to about the 17th century that if you wanted to grind something, you got some rocks and you bashed stuff between them. Millstones, mortar and pestle, that kind of stuff. But when metallurgy gets going, it turns out there are things that are better and more efficient. There are some things that are better to grind using mills made of metal rather than mills made of stone. And this is especially true when the things to be ground are pricey, like spices and coffee, or for items people want to grind at a small scale, maybe in their home kitchens. So for these things, spices and coffee, smaller, portable, metal-wheeled or burr mills started to be manufactured. And if you're curious, the burr refers to the rough protuberances that would be carved into a pair of metal discs or wheels. And then these are set to turn against each other with just a small space in between. Usually one wheel turns over a stationary one, standard mill stuff. You can adjust the spacing, and then you can grind an item between them into larger or finer pieces. And turning the crank on one of these multiplied your muscle power, and the resulting ground items were more regular in size compared to what you got from the direct pounding done using a mortar and pestle. The earliest coffee mills were literally just spice grinders, especially as spices and coffee were often sold alongside each other in markets. They had similar origins and needed similar storage conditions. And so it also makes it clear how cardamom coffee happened, which is incredibly popular in the areas around coffee's home. Spice and coffee merchants were clearly combining coffee with all manner of different spices, and they just stuck with what they found they liked the best. Brass was the original metal preferred for coffee mills. This alloy of copper and zinc is sturdy, is slow to corrode, and polishes easily to produce low friction surfaces. That made it slower to wear against itself in these cranking machines. Back in these days, it filled the space that is currently taken up by stainless steel alloys. So it was preferred for all manner of mechanical items, including spice and coffee mills. The earliest coffee mills used in America were simply the imported coffee grinders commonly used in North Africa and along the Eastern Mediterranean coffee drinking societies. But they tended to produce a very fine grind in what we would typically call Turkish coffee. And this potent, thick brew was unappealing to the American coffee drinker, so they tended to lean towards repurposed spice grinders imported from the same region, that drawer type. As England industrialized, they started producing their own coffee grinders, both the sort with a mill over a drawer that were modeled on spice grinders, but they also created their own, often wall-mounted mills. And these were sold to the emerging coffee houses and large estates with their enormous kitchens. And of course, an early wall-mounted coffee mill was installed in Monticello, along with every other gadget to be found in the era. The larger grind Americans preferred on their beans, the lighter color they tended to roast their beans. After all, many of them thought a fully roasted bean was burnt, and their access to sugar led Americans to prepare and ultimately prefer a weak, long-boiled coffee that almost always required sweetening whenever it could be had. And as you can see from the roasting and brewing instructions provided, coffee was somewhat coded as a masculine drink. Coffee consumption had been heavily masculine through the end of the 18th century, with most coffee consumption happening outside of the home in spaces like taverns that were generally barred to women. Well, respectable women. Well, ladies, A tavern would often serve as a place to gather, smoke, to talk, to carouse, to drink spirituous liquors and ale, and coffee. The place where the Boston Tea Party was planned, the Green Dragon, was, of all things, a coffee house and tavern. But as with all things, as they become less exclusive, more common, and less expensive, they spread around, and coffee started to enter into homes. While tea avoidance hadn't ever really taken off, tea-taking in highly visible social settings had dropped off. So having coffee as a social alternative to English tea, especially when you could get it from the French, our further friends in the War of 1812, that caused coffee to be more present and more acceptable in feminine spaces. As you can see from the instructions up top, rather lengthy if I do say so myself, the fact that it could be made freshly from the long-keeping green beans made it quite easy to get a fresh cup of coffee anywhere you had a fire, water, and an iron pot. Tea, on the other hand, had a good chance of being musty or stale, and there was no way to bring it back. And, as you know from last week, quite a bit of tea wasn't so much tea as it was, quote, tea, unquote. Coffee, on the other hand, anyone could see that a coffee bean was a coffee bean. You could smell it was dry, good, green coffee. You could roast it yourself, and then you could ensure it was freshly ground. And this was true whether you were right there getting it fresh off the boat in Newport, or you lived at the north end of the Hudson River, or if it was a special treat you bought for your family in Kentucky, or you were cooking for an officer in a fort out in the wilds of Indian Territory. No matter how far off the main road you were, coffee could be made fresh. Being able to really see what you were getting and not having to deal with all those dusty, musty bits of leaves made it appealing. Now, on the fun side of coffee, while tea was being adulterated for the American consumer by the producers, shippers, and merchants along the way, American coffee drinkers were often happy to adulterate their coffee all on their own, or come up with their own entire fakes. Just as how you can now look up hot new product dupe on the internet and find out why getting the real thing is a sucker's bet, and how an alternate quality Birkin bag or Lafufu is really what you want, all manner of coffee alternatives were also being offered. Some were seen as something gentler for ladies, for invalids, and for children. They might be a way to stretch coffee or to replace it altogether. Coffee replacement might be due to frugality or simply favor. The most famous coffee replacement and stretcher is chicory. This is the root from a plant in the Asteraceae or daisy family. A similar variety has always been bred for its leaves. Young chicory leaves can add a pleasant bitterness to salads and cooked green mixes. Some of that same bitterness is present in its cousin, the Belgian endive. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, a root-focused chicory that was roasted and ground as a coffee substitute became best known first in Prussia in the late 1700s, when Frederick the Great became annoyed with coffee and made it hard for people to get it. and drink it. Chicories were a fairly common crop, particularly in the more southerly colonies and then states, and would become a popular coffee stretcher and then replacement throughout the South when coffee was short. Roasted and ground okra seeds were known as another stand-in. Further up north, where more grain and peas were grown, a large variety of roasted grains were offered up as coffee replacements. Roasted wheat, rye, and field peas were apparently preferred. Burnt breadcrumbs were also a stand-in. There are a number of recipes with titles like boys' coffee that are brewed burned breadcrumbs strained and then sweetened with sugar and milk. Mormons and enthusiasts of the vegetable diet would expound on the virtue of roasted grains over coffee, how the flavor was better, and the ingredient of more healthful virtue. As a side note, you can get things like roasted barley and even corn to brew like tea in Korean groceries, and I do like them. They're very refreshing. But at no time am I going to attempt to tell you that they are in any way a replacement for coffee. They're definitely their own thing. And I can't imagine roasted ground field peas in any way make anything that imitates coffee in anything except for color. So with coffee starting to appear everywhere, is it anything but a drink yet? I mean, iced creams are out there. Is there coffee iced cream? Is there coffee puddings? Coffee creams? It turns out, yes, a little. Basically, coffee was a flavor of other things in about the same way it is now. If it's sweet and creamy, a coffee flavor version might be an option. Nearly all uses for coffee other than a drink have it mixed with large quantities of milk or cream, thoroughly sweetened, and then it's often set with eggs, often just the egg yolks. And as iced creams are still rare at this time, it's not really an ice cream flavor I have run across. But as ice cream becomes more common with the rise in manufactured ice, turning those set creams, which are custards, into ice cream, which is made from a custard base, is right around the corner. But for the most part, coffee is still just a drink rather than a flavor, basically the way it is now. But the best way to know that coffee was all around was the emergence of coffee cup as a common measurement in cookbooks alongside teacup, wine glass, tablespoon, and teaspoon. While scouring through all those cookbooks for information, I ran across something that caught my eye. It was that a celery stand was an important and decorative item that might grace a fine table, which got me thinking, what? Celery has its own stand? Clearly, there are things afoot in vegetable land, and I need to chase after it and see what's going on. So next episode is time to look at the state of the vegetable side of American food. What is going on over there, and just how exciting was the arrival of celery? Thanks for listening. There's really only one way this podcast grows, and that's by word of mouth. So don't be afraid to share this with any of your food or history curious friends. Thank you to all of you who have recently commented on the show. It's nice to get a little feedback. I read them all whether I respond or not. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And as always, I enjoy interacting with people on the social medias. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, and Insta as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.